Welcome to another conversation with me, Nikki.
And I'm Scylla.
And for this conversation, we are looking at the subject of infertility, which for many, many couples who face it is a very hard journey. It's a hard road. It's faced with disappointment. It can put a lot of pressure onto a couple's relationship. And today, we have the great privilege of talking to a couple who have traveled this journey, and we're going to hear how what they have done to stay united as a couple. And we want to welcome Andy and Sarah Lang.
Hi guys. Thanks.
Hi, Andy and Sarah. It's really great to have you here with us, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and being so open and prepared to talk about this really hard subject.
Now, we know that for you, this whole journey of infertility actually, I think, started even before you met. I think it is right, isn't it, Sarah, that when you were 18, there was a doctor who confirmed that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for you to conceive. What was that like at that age and at that stage?
Yeah, so you're right, at 18. So there'd been a family history on my mum's side of some fertility struggles. So she very wisely, when I was 18, took me to see a fertility consultant just for some advice regarding the family's history, and he did paint a fairly bleak picture as to my kind of future fertility. Obviously I was only 18 then, I was unmarried, I was a Christian, but I didn't have a boyfriend, I didn't have anyone sort of on the scene. The advice they gave me at the time was quite unhelpful, really. He just said, I suggest you get pregnant as soon as you possibly can to ensure that that you do, which obviously at that age and stage of my life was wholly impractical. And it was just really awkward if my mum sat next to me, him telling me to go and get pregnant. But yeah, I knew then, that was 22 years ago, and I thought this is potentially going to be difficult. And then I was very upfront with Andy about that before we ever even got engaged. It was something we talked about when the relationship seemed to be serious and looked like it had a future, but I was incredibly honest with Andy about that. Of course, would never hold that back. And Andy was incredibly gracious from the beginning about all of that. So,
and Andy, what was your reaction? What was your feeling when Sarah told you that?
I mean, my overwhelming feeling was one of sympathy, clearly, for her to have been given that diagnosis. It didn't faze me in terms of our future. I'm sort of quite an optimistic guy, I guess. I suppose I just figured it would be all right somehow, some way. And of course, by that time, I'd fallen in love with Sarah, so I couldn't imagine a future without her, with or without children at that point. So
I think it's really important to mention as well that Andy had a daughter from a previous marriage. So that was incredibly helpful in the whole thing, because for me, entering a relationship with Andy, knowing that we had this beautiful little girl in our lives as well, I personally didn't feel at that point, as a young woman entering a serious relationship, that I was preventing Andy from experiencing what it would be to be a father. And I know every couple's story is very different, and that's actually not the case for the majority of couples experiencing infertility. But for me personally, I never felt, oh my gosh, I can't give you that title. and I don't think you felt the pressure. I think Andy felt optimistic, but if it didn't happen, that was also okay. So that was unique to us, but it was helpful.
Yeah.
So when you got to the stage of having been married a while and realizing that actually together a baby was not going to be forthcoming, that must have started to be hard for you both, and you must have been in situations, I mean, there's so many situations. One is around other families, other friends with babies, being invited to baby showers with you know, how did you kind of start to live with this thing of perhaps you might not have a baby?
Well, you're right, and you've identified a lot of the key features there. I suppose in our early marriage, we didn't really feel it too much. I think we didn't feel it too much for a whole number of reasons. One, we weren't necessarily even ready to have children initially anyway. We wanted to have a few years of marriage in any event. Our friends at that stage weren't necessarily having babies either. And as Sarah said, we already had my daughter, who was very much part of our lives. So there wasn't really a sense of urgency initially. But as time progressed and those situations started to change, the spotlight grew brighter, I suppose, on our struggles. And the reality of it started really to hit home, that it perhaps wasn't just going to be okay, and that the diagnosis that Sarah had at 18 was proven to be correct, I suppose. And that it was almost sort of a process of realization over a prolonged period of time. And then as the years rolled by, and peer groups were then having child 2, child 3, in many cases child 4, it became increasingly painful.
And as Andy said, very much that spotlight was on us as people around us started having families. We could no longer sort of hide it or whatever. It's certainly something that I felt people were then starting to notice, and the questions, or when will you be having the questions we have maybe asked others ourselves, have been asked 1,000 times: when are you going to have a family? When are you going to have children? Particularly with me being a paediatric nurse, I love children, and Chloe was asking for a sibling endlessly. So
that's my daughter.
There was it started to take its toll.
And I think as Sarah often says, and maybe we'll come on to this later, I don't know, but infertility is a grieving process, but it's a rather unique grieving process in that it actually gets worse all the time, not better. And so the grief becomes more profound, more painful, and more agonizing. And for me, I suppose, firstly, as a man, secondly, as although infertility is very much a joint issue, I don't say it's Sarah's problem. It's something that we are facing together in our marriage, very much. But by the same token, it was Sarah who had that diagnosis at 18, and what I found very helpful was a piece of research that was brought to my attention, where a study was undertaken in the grief response, or rather the stress response, should I say, sorry, to particular diagnoses. So the researchers studied the stress responses in someone with a diagnosis of cancer, someone with a diagnosis of HIV, and someone with a diagnosis of infertility, and the response was identical in all three. And for me, like I say, as a man, as someone who's already was and is a father to a daughter, and who didn't necessarily have that diagnosis given to me personally, it really helped in legitimizing and understanding and validating what Sarah was experiencing.
And it helped me because I knew I felt awful, and I knew that I found keeping up appearances, for want of a better word, really hard. But to hear that the physiological response to stress in those situations was equal was so validating to the pain I felt.
That's
amazing. Can I just pick up on the thing about the working through grief, working through loss, and one of the things we hear from couples facing infertility is they're traveling this really hard journey, but it can be very difficult to talk to anybody else about it, and therefore they become more isolated as a result. So the journey is even harder. What was your experience? Were there people you found you could talk to? Was it that very difficult? How did you choose who to talk to?
you're right. I think so. It's such an intensely personal situation. You know, it's so incredibly personal and private that in itself causes it to be fairly taboo, I guess, in society and within the church particularly. I hadn't really heard it spoken about. For me personally, I'd say less than half a dozen people knew. So my parents knew, and a close friend, and Andy, and my grandmother. Really, I didn't involve anybody, and I didn't involve anybody for 10 years. So, or maybe more than 10 years of marriage, but way even when I was 18 until getting married, sort of, I really didn't tell anybody. I kept it incredibly close to my chest, and I had some very well rehearsed responses to the questions about when I might have children or when was a family on the card. I'd rehearsed some answers that I gave verbatim that weren't particularly truthful, to be honest, but they deflected. You know, you can excuse your career progression or whatever you're doing at the time, but no, there was only one or two people who really knew, and it's very isolating, and it is lonely, because actually even those who knew, of those few, one or two were incredibly present and supportive, but generally they were the people closest to me, and they were just at a loss themselves. And I think they just didn't know, my parents included, who I have a fantastic relationship with, and who my mum had some experiences later in her life with fertility, but they just didn't know what to say or how to stand by and how to advise. And
what would your advice to couples in a situation like yourselves now be, in terms of that sense of sort of isolation and not really knowing who to talk to, or whether you should or you shouldn't? What would your advice be?
I think in an ideal world, if they could find another couple who'd experienced the same thing as them, that they felt they had some confidence in, and they had, you know, the trust that they would keep their confidence in what they're telling them, then I would suggest it back into that kind of couple, because it's the sort of, I guess, like most experiences like this, grief experiences, be it any sort of disease, sickness, anything, it's so much easier to give appropriate advice and support if you've experienced it yourself. So certainly that would be the ideal. Failing that, then again, a sensitive person in their life, who a good listener, who is empathetic, who can at least try to understand what it is to face infertility. And, you know, so maybe, you know, the mother of 6 children is perhaps not necessarily the best person to ask. But certainly to share it with somebody, yes, I would wholeheartedly recommend that. I think trying to deal with it just within your marriage puts a huge strain on each other. To try to be all things to each other is very difficult.
It's too big. It's too big for the confines. It's in a way, the intimacy of a marriage and the closeness of a marriage is the perfect place to be safe and share all you feel about it. But as Andy said, you can't possibly be all that each other need, because you're both devastated and you're both grieving. And, you know, I was grieving, Andy was grieving, but he didn't want to put any degree of pressure on me by expressing sometimes how he actually really felt, because that might make me feel worse. But then that can be misunderstood for, well, do you not feel anything, you know, if you're not saying anything? And I think Andy's right. Finding either someone who's been in that situation or who supported people who've been in that situation is so helpful. But also, just anyone who you think would pray for you if you're a Christian, or if you appreciate to be prayed for, if you don't mind being prayed for, someone who would have the longevity. And I think for us, longevity was really important. Our journey was long, and a lot of the people over the years who maybe did find out over time or whatever, you know, people were so kind, but the longevity was something that was hard for all, and I felt some fell off the scene a little bit. And you bear all, and you tell them this, and then they're kind of gone. You know, you don't get any follow-up messages or over the years of how you're doing or what's going on, and it felt very exposing. So I think I would personally say having a small group of supporters rather than a large one is probably good for guarding your heart a bit and not being open to too much disappointment. Quite honestly, people are generally in this life are very kind, but when you're experiencing infertility, I was just so sensitive, and people couldn't do right for wrong half the time. If they asked me how I was upset, and if they didn't ask me how I was upset. So it's very hard as a supporter of somebody to get it right, and I hold my hands up and acknowledge that wholly. You know, you can't really be a perfect person in that situation because it's an imperfect situation, but I think a small cohort.
So someone who's in for the long haul.
Yeah, basically, who would stick in. We had a friend, we have many friends who prayed. There was 3 elderly ladies from my home church where I grew up who met every Monday to pray for me for 20 years to have a baby. So I know people prayed, but I know a friend locally just set an alarm on her phone for the same time every day for over a decade and prayed for us. And there was no particular bells and whistles over that, but I was with her many a time when that alarm went off, and I knew it was for me, and I was just so touched that she would do that for such a long time.
We'd love to know, what advice would you give to couples who are facing infertility, who are experiencing it, in terms of staying united as a couple? What are the things that you found helpful, or perhaps other things you found unhelpful from your own experience?
Well, first off, we've done your course on your marriage course, both your preparation and marriage course, and we've taken other couples through it. And in all seriousness, without wishing to sound sycophantic, I would wholeheartedly recommend that as a resource. Some fantastic materials in there, and you know, despite going through it a dozen times now, I guess, on and off with various couples and ourselves, I still extract something new from that every time. So there's a lot of good principles in there. And so, but I think fundamentally for us, and this is borrowing one of your analogies, is infertility is not Sarah's problem. It's our problem, and it's absolutely clearly not her fault. And this is something that we face together. And that is in terms of the dealing with the awkward questions, dealing with the invites to baby showers, dealing with the invites to a christening, dealing with any of these things, we face together. And particularly when we're exploring treatment options, we face those together. And so those sorts of decisions are always made jointly. It sounds cliche, but of course communication is imperative. Being alive to those issues, you know, as as a man, being aware of Mother's Day being round the corner and arranging something else other than going to the Sunday service at church where all the mothers are invited to stand up in the church to celebrate Mother's Day, and seeing Sarah remaining in her seat. That is clearly not a helpful situation for Sarah, and it's one that I would try to avoid. So I think it's being proactive, it's facing it together, it's talking about how you're feeling at any given time. Of course, over all those years, it's a roller coaster. You know, it really is up and down in the emotions. It really is, and it's being sensitive to that and alive to those things.
And I think talking. I was just going to say, talking about it was so pivotal and so key. It was an open table all the time. It was never off limits. but we did set boundaries because it's such an open conversation, and because it can dominate, and because it can rear itself in so many unexpected ways. You can go through days or weeks or even months of feeling pretty okay, and then something curveballs and you just get slammed again. And we would always have an open table to talk about it, but we did set boundaries on the time of day or night. So we might draw a close to conversations an hour before bed so we could sleep, or we might just have a bath together, or watch a quick box set at the end of a heavy conversation, something to lighten it, to just sort of clear it. And then sometimes we'd go away to talk about it. So we'd say, let's go away and really thrash out where we're at, what we're feeling. And other times we'd go away to not talk about it. So we just set the boundaries and the kind of, but that said, if we were going away to not talk about it and one of us crashed halfway through the weekend and needed to talk, of course we would listen. But it was communication, boundaries, and also, I know this is going to sound contradictory, but we diarised fun. Yeah. We are so cool like that. And we would put in our diary, you have to diarise your sex, but you also have to diarise your fun, because
usually they're both the same thing.
You would hope so.
And that was exactly, I was going to drill down into that.
Yes.
Well, sex.
Fun.
Sex and the fun. No, I mean, because you mentioned the marriage course, and obviously part of that is we talk about and look at how important a part of continuing to build not only your emotional connection, but the physical connection brings the emotional connection, and how we have to be intentional about building that. But in your situation, and for couples who are facing infertility, it would just be great to hear how you navigated that, because I imagine there are times when it feels a real challenge, when it really feels like, well, this is just a kind of performance and it's associated with disappointment, and it's like all the associations are not positive. Tell us about how you've managed that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, we're really happy to be very honest about that, and as both from a medical background, we're certainly not embarrassed to say. But I mean, obviously, unless there's a reason that couples can't conceive without intervention, so if they know that they will not be able to conceive with their own egg and sperm, but for couples who know there's maybe a slight possibility, or they hope there is, then of course sex is a huge part, and your lovemaking is a huge part of the story. And I was thinking about this a bit today, and just thinking, I think you have to be let's just be really realistic and put it on the table that when you're married, there are already, as you develop your love life together and your intimacy, there are different types of lovemaking, and there are different types of sex, I suppose, and couples will probably relate to that. And that's just seasons, and it's sometimes it's really passionate, other times it's really funny, other times it's somewhere in between. But when it comes to sort of trying to make a baby, and what goes where and why and when, I do think it's near on impossible to ensure that every time that you make love to your husband or wife, that it with the aim of getting pregnant. I think it's unrealistic to expect it to be your most special, intimate, natural, spontaneous lovemaking. So I think that needs to be taken off the table, because it's just not possible. You can light as many candles as you want and half burn the house down, but the fact is, A has to go into B, and there has to be a sperm making a way to an egg at some point. So personally, I mean, we had a period of 10 years where we decided, and we were aware that if there was any chance, which they'd said there wasn't really, but if there was any chance of me getting pregnant, it meant that there was always chance of a sperm meeting an egg. So i.e. there always had to be some sperm swimming around inside me all the time.
Absolutely
devastating. So that meant, because of the sperm's life cycle and things, that meant making love every other day for us. Now, for some couples, that might be what their pattern of lovemaking is anyway, or fantastic. But when you have to, and I work shifts as a nurse, so that, definitely look at creative. Let's not think about all the ways we had to try and make that happen. But we actually just had to try and really lighten the mood with the lovemaking that was related to baby making. And I think for us, the way we coped was to try and have fun rather than try and make it earth-shattering. Because if you're not aroused or if you're not in the mood, it is a bit of an odd experience making love to your spouse if you're not in any of that place. And so we had like a code word for the type of sex we needed to have.
That is brilliant. I think that's absolutely brilliant. We're very, very kind of keen on code words of building up your own personal, private.
But we're not going to ask you to tell us your code word.
I could, and he was like, "Yeah, that's fine, but I won't." But I didn't get permission. But we had sort of a code word for that sort of lovemaking. But then equally, we had times where we would take a break from trying to conceive. Actually, so we'd be like, "Oh, we're having a month or 3 or 4 months off," and therefore our intimacy could be repaired and restored a bit, and the sex was nothing to do with making a baby. Of course, it might be a tiny bit in the back of your mind, but it wasn't to do with ovulation sticks or taking a temperature charts or anything.
And Sarah's right. Sometimes I think she's described a decade of trying, and but I'd say there were throughout those years there were quite long periods of time here and there where we deliberately, after maybe one of the weekends away where we went away to talk about it, where when we came home, we'd agreed that for 3 months, in some instances, we're not going to try to have a baby. We're just going to try and put it down. It's not going to be the focus of our conversation. It's not going to be on the forefront of our minds when we're being intimate with one another, to the best of our ability anyway. And we would take quite sabbaticals, I suppose, from it. And actually that was really helpful. Like you said, it was really helpful in reinstilling that intimacy, and reminding us about the beautiful things of marriage in that respect. But also it helped us get some perspective on where we were going to go next.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being so practical, honest,
amazing,
down to earth. We know that'll be huge help to people, couples facing infertility who are listening to this. Now, through this interview, you've talked about praying, talked about going to church, and we'd love you to talk a bit about what have you learned as Christians? How has your Christian faith grown through actually what's been a very hard and at times painful journey?
It's a very good question, and we'll try and keep the answer as short as we can because there's some very long answers to that. I think for me personally, theologically, there's been some challenges as we've explored different treatment options, and so I've spent, frankly, years at times looking at some of those options and exploring those. And through that, you gain a deeper understanding of how to read and interpret the Bible. So certainly that's one aspect of it. I suppose another aspect of it is how to journey well when things aren't working out the way you think they should. And that's both in terms of our faith. How do you keep your faith? How do you keep the faith, frankly, when circumstantial evidence around you is indicating that perhaps it's not justified? And so finding a relationship with God in the midst of that has been a real, well, I would say now a blessing. At the time, a challenge.
I would say, so obviously, people watching this, maybe who are or aren't affected by infertility, one of the first questions they may have with anyone who has a faith is, well, what about, your belief in God to heal? And that was something that came up quite a lot. Personally, I never had to wrestle with God over his ability to heal physically. I wholeheartedly believed every day of the 20 years that I was battling with infertility that God could heal me. I had no doubt about it. I know he's a God who steps in and does supernatural things that you know, that blow medics' minds away. I had no doubt about that. It wasn't whether he could, but it was whether he would. And that was my sticking point for a long time. It wasn't, can you, God? It's, well, will you? And that was something I had to just really work through. I think the things I've taken away from the time would, you know, it's easy to have a bit of a pity party and feel like I lost 2 decades of my younger years that should have been full of vibrancy and dreams fulfilled, I suppose. And infertility ate away at so much. I couldn't really make career plans because I didn't know if I'd be having a family. I couldn't really make travel plans because I didn't know if I'd be having a family. You know, everything was on hold. And I think the things I've sort of come away with genuinely are that I've really wholeheartedly learned that waiting time isn't wasting time. And I got to know God in a season of waiting and a season of uncertainty in the most personal and powerful and profound and perfect way that I never would have ordinarily seen or tasted or touched his presence, his kindness, his goodness to me, had I not been relating to him through the lens of infertility. I really feel like my relationship with God has been all the more rich and all the more real as a result. So I don't feel that it was one of the areas of collateral damage. I feel like just my appreciation for God, perhaps ironically, was just enlarged, and my worship, particularly worship, became so much more powerful and so much more intimate. The ability to sing truth. I am ever grateful for worship leaders and songwriters who put scriptural truths into song that would become my soundtrack and my mantra, and just getting that truth right into the core of me on the days where it was just so hard. There was always a song. There was always a song. And if the song's based in scripture, then it's come direct from the throne room anyway. So I learned that waiting time wasn't wasting time. I learned things that he beckons me. He doesn't bury me, you know, that it's always a call to come closer.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we know, because we know you a bit, that you, over this journey and over the years, you sort of grew this passion to help other people going through a similar journey. And you, I think it was about 4 years ago, you started an organization you called Rhythm of Hope.
Yeah.
And I know that you had just started that when 12 years into your marriage, you actually conceived a baby.
Yes.
Why don't you just kind of finish off our conversation this evening by telling us about both those things and about how your passion sort of was the catalyst to start Rhythm of Hope?
Well, I think on one of the weekends away that we've mentioned a few times now, we were having a conversation and about where we were going to go next in our fertility journey. And Sarah had often had this long-held ambition that at the end of this journey she would perhaps write a book or do something. And she turned to me and said, actually, I think we need to do something now. I don't think we can wait until we've had a baby. I don't think we can wait until we've had our outcome, because it might never come. And I think it gives a validity to an event or anything that you say if you are in the trenches with those to whom you're speaking. So that's what birthed the Rhythm of Hope, which is a day-long retreat that we run every year. And we started it in January 2015, I think was the first. 16, January 2016 was the first one. And we frankly, quite selfishly, tabled a day that we wanted to go to. So we invited people to speak from whom we wanted to hear. And we cover everything from keeping love alive in a marriage to dealing with anxiety, to the theological response to some of the treatment options, to all sorts of things. And we have interviews with couples who have been through various treatment options to hear their stories. And it's just an opportunity for people who are going through infertility to come together and be around other people. We've discussed this during this conversation about how it's a lonely journey. And for some couples who come, they haven't told anybody at all, not even their parents. Nobody knows. And yet they have the tremendous courage to come for a day. And it's very exposing. You see when they arrive how vulnerable they feel. But hopefully by the end of the day, they leave with their heads up with some hope and optimism. So that was the vision, and that is the Rhythm of Hope.
And it's not a healing day. It is a Christian sort of based day, in that there's some sung worship, and the talks are, some of the talks are based on things we found helpful in our Christian faith, but it's also done very practically in terms of, as Andy said, the mental health side of things, the more medical side of things. And also our team. It's a very discreet and private day. It's a closed event. It's not recorded. It's not broadcasted. No one wears like a name badge or anything horrendous like that. I just literally, it's just so anonymous, but we try and do it where there's something for everyone. And some of our team are still very much trying and waiting and hoping for children. Others have, through various options, built a family one way or the other. And there are others on our team, very importantly, who have chosen to stop trying for children and to look to a future as a family with their spouse, but without children. And that also is a really important part of the day that we try to get across. So it's just, I guess it's the thing we wished had been there when we started out. That's what the vision was.
And I think from that day, it really helped us formulate where we were going to go next and what we were going to do. And ultimately, as you've already said, that resulted in the birth of our son. So,
I mean, that was, just to be very clear, that Andy and I had put a time frame on our trying for children, and we had very much reached a place where we'd agreed that certainly by my 40th birthday we would be putting this down. So we knew there was going to be an end to our trying and to our exploring, hoping, praying, everything, our planning. And so we knew by the time I was 40 that would be a difficult birthday for me, potentially, because it would be the end of this season for us. And we had really put some lines in the sand, which is a bigger conversation, but something that's important for couples trying, really important. You can't just try forever. And so it was, to our shock, really, and surprise, we very, very much towards the end of our journey, and through the help of the Rhythm of Hope, ironically, we benefited so much from the day ourselves. And we decided to accept the offer of some fertility treatment, which up until that point for a decade, we hadn't accepted any assisted fertility treatment. We decided to accept the offer. We decided between the two of us how many rounds of treatment we felt were appropriate. And that was for many reasons. But, you know, you have to look at the financial implications. We weren't covered on the NHS, so it was self-funded. Due to my age, and so we had to just have some boundaries in place. And so we had a round of fertility treatment, which we both were, having spent so long deliberating over, we went into very excitedly, actually, with hopes sky high that it would be just perfect in every way. We had an army praying for us by this point, and we felt very confident. And that treatment resulted in the loss of a potential twin pregnancy, 2 embryos that we lost, and it was utterly devastating. We were beyond crushed. We couldn't believe that was sort of the end of the whole thing. But for many reasons, the medical specialists gave us reasons to explain why it was unsuccessful and wanted us to try one more time. They had a bit more knowledge about my body and the situation and what perhaps had failed that last time. So we very reluctantly underwent our last go. This was now our absolute last, you know, we'd set our boundary lines. It was our last go. We didn't involve anybody other than our immediate family this time. It was incredibly done very quietly. And yeah, to our amazement, I was pregnant with our little boy. So it might sound odd, but it was just such a shock, which sounds weird when you've tried so hard, but we'd all but hung up our kind of hopes and decided that we were done. And then this surprise, this gift really came at the very last second in our son.
Well, we know that was 22 months ago.
Yeah.
You have a little boy, Ezra.
Yeah.
But we also know you've continued to be passionate about helping other couples who are on this journey that you have been on.
Wholeheartedly. Yeah.
And
And really, yeah, we are.
All I would say is, of course, it sometimes feels, you know, our story is that while it all ended happily in the end, we didn't know that was going to be the case. There was years and years prior to that, and I think all the truths that we found along the way in our faith and in our marriage and just in life are still valid. And you know, that isn't going to be every couple's story.
Yeah.
It just isn't. It very nearly wasn't our story, and you know what Sarah was explaining there was during that, it was only when we went to see the consultant for our follow-up appointment following the failed pregnancies that they offered us another round of treatment. As far as we were concerned, it was over.
Yeah.
And for many couples, that's where they get to. And you know, I could weep for those couples.
Yeah, and we are so. In closing, we just want to say that we are so sensitive to this issue, and although we have our son, a baby doesn't cure you of infertility. I'm still infertile, and having a baby doesn't eradicate the years that you have journeyed through infertility. And we are just so sensitive to that and so passionate that couples would just find a place where they can realize they're not alone, where we can try and point them to Jesus and give them some perspective and some hope for the future, regardless of the outcome of their journey. And that's our tagline, really. It's of the Rhythm of Hope, is journeying well, regardless of the outcome. And for us, it was a matter of finding a place where we could say, and even if not, he is still good. And this story, we don't want to finish an interview with, oh, and then they had a baby, because this story isn't about Ezra. Our story isn't about our son, although he's a joy and a gift to us, who we're forever thankful for. But for us, it's been about God, and it's been about how he's come alongside and into the pain of our situation and transformed it so that we can genuinely say we wouldn't have actually had it any other way. And that's the miracle for us.
Well, can I say that everything you said will be an incredible help to any couple who is going through this journey, and also to actually couples who are not going through this journey but want to walk alongside people, because actually probably all of us know people in that situation. And what you've shared tonight and what you've lived in your marriage is an incredibly inspirational and encouraging thing for other couples, whatever the situation.
And we want to say that sensitivity has come through this whole conversation. So Andy and Sarah, thank you very, very much indeed for speaking to us today.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you
Thanks for having us. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.